Okay everyone, we're just about ready to start if you'd like to come together. I really appreciate everybody coming along today. Um, this is a huge issue in our community. Um, 2 weeks ago we lost a man, a farmer, a very strong dad, husband. We lost him to suicide, and it's just not good enough that we are still losing farmers to suicide because they feel like they're being pushed to the brink, that they have nowhere else to go. So for me it's a very personal thing. I got very angry that it happened again, and I felt that we just needed to do something. We needed to do something to show our support for the farmers who are doing it so tough for so many reasons. So I decided that we would have basically a memorial for George Bender from Chinchilla, but also have an opportunity to express our support for all of our farmers in the South Burnett and across the country. I'm going to start by reading a statement from the Bender family. I didn't know George. I've learned so much about him since he's passed, but I believe the family has the right words here for him. George Thomas Bender was born on the 12th of June 1947 and spent his life as one of 5 generations of Benders who have, since 1907, farmed in the Chinchilla district. In an area renowned for its prime agricultural land, George was raised and educated in the knowledge and skills of farming from his family, which he in turn passed on to his own children. With his wife Pam, George raised 4 sons and a daughter on the same property and in the same house in which he was raised. 3 of those sons have continued farming on the family properties and other lands in the Chinchilla area. Whether he was playing sport, coaching youngsters, judging at the local agricultural shows, or simply giving those in need some help and advice, George's contribution to agriculture, the community and his family was part of what made him a well-known and highly regarded pillar in the Western Downs area. As a farmer, George's commitment to sustainability and innovation saw him willingly assist agricultural research by supporting cropping trials for various private and government organisations on his land. The need to undertake and develop more sustainable and productive agricultural practices underscored significant changes and investments in his farming methods over his working life. While I'm reading this, I would also like you to think about who you know that this also describes. Integrity is the word most often associated with George, both before and after his death. In the way he farmed, the quality of his produce was never compromised, and nothing would be sold, sent to market or shared with others unless it was of the highest quality. The fact that he won local awards for his wheat, cotton and pigs are examples of this. It was George's commitment to clean and green produce and long-term sustainable agriculture that caused him to carefully examine the claims of CSG companies when they arrived 10 years ago. George questioned the environmental claims of this industry and the right of CSG companies to impose on the lives and activities of the landholders in the Chinchilla and Hopeland areas. He refused to enter into compensation agreements with these companies, notwithstanding enormous pressure to do so. He advised others against the same, but unfortunately witnessed the impact on the environment and the lives of a number of his neighbours as fracking commenced. Wells were constructed, pipelines and other infrastructure were built. Over the last decade, George stood up to a number of big gas companies, including QCG, Arrow and Origin. In George's view, all had the same intent and agenda. Their interest was in getting the gas, and they didn't really care about the lives of the farmers on whose land they would trample to access it. Throughout Australia, even though you buy or own land, it is the government who controls the right to the minerals beneath the surface. However, once the government sells the rights to large companies, often from overseas, to extract those minerals, neither the farmer nor the landowner has the right to prevent the impact to the surface of the land and other environmental resources such as water and soil quality. George stood for, quite simply, the right for a farmer to say no. George was a straight talker, often of few words, who, as described by one son, told the truth, not the sugar-coated bullshit. He was willing to talk openly to anyone who was interested in really seeing what was happening as a result of the CSG industry. He was tenacious in contacting government departments, company officials, and in making himself available to the media, often at significant personal cost. It is fitting that a small amount of this work can still be viewed by the public online in media reports about the cause of Western Downs farmers. He pointed out to those who had the privilege of his company in simple and straightforward terms that the company stood to make large profits from the mining of these gas resources. In doing so, there are short-term booms, but long-term destruction to the land and water resources that are of much greater long-term value than the profits dispensed to a few shareholders or the votes courted by a few politicians. There were many politicians, both at a state and federal level, who heard from George. He demanded from our politicians a higher standard. The litany of letters that were left unanswered and telephone calls not returned reflects the political inaction and unwillingness to look at the impacts of this industry by all except the likes of Glenn Lazarus and Larissa Waters. In a submission to the Senate inquiry to investigate certain aspects of Queensland government administration related to government affairs in November last year, George stated, "The government has provided the CSG companies with all the power, leaving an individual farmer to protect himself against multinational companies. The decision whether or not to have CSG on our property should be a commercial decision. It should be the right of the farmer to choose what affects his business on a commercial basis. The situation the government has created leaves the process open for bullying, intimidation, and potential corruption." George, like many farmers of his generation, left school early to support his family working on the land. However, despite the lack of formal education, this did not prevent George spending many hours, night after night, studying the relevant legislation and correspondence from the companies he was standing up to. This led, in the view of many, to George having a better understanding of the relevant law than many others, including company executives and lawyers. He called many to account in the companies, government and the community for their lack of due process and honesty in claims about the CSG operations. What became clear as regards environmental authority issued in respect of the Origin tenement affecting George's land, as well as others in the area, is that it was issued without the correct procedures being followed under the Environmental Protection Act. Critical environmental issues information required to enable environmental impact assessments prior to approvals was never submitted. This pattern has enabled the companies to respond to criticisms by pleading a lack of available data in order to measure impacts, such lack being a result of misfeasance by those who had the responsibility to make sure that legislative processes were followed. Since 2005, George confronted and stood up to QCG, Arrow and most recently Origin in them seeking to construct a number of wells on one of his properties. It is from this land that George had over the years grown and harvested a number of award-winning crops. The impact of CSG on neighbouring properties had caused his bores to run dry and bubble with noxious methane, something that was not caused by anything other than the mining activities in the area. The threats most recently from Origin can simply be stated as follows. You agree to our terms or we enter a process that, should you resist, inevitably ends up in court. In 2011, George raised concerns about the impact of UCG, underground coal gasification, arising from the operations of Link Energy in the Hopeland area. This response from Peter Bond, CEO and Managing Director of Link Energy, was to deny all such claims and a direct threat to have George Bender declared a vexatious complainant and or commence legal action for damages for injurious falsehood. It is notable that the property on which George was raised and lived until his untimely death is now within an exclusion zone imposed by the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection as a result of investigations into Link activities. These investigations form the basis of a criminal prosecution against Link, now before the courts, for causing serious environmental harm. Notwithstanding the potential impacts of this on the farms and livelihoods of the many landholders in that area, a request on behalf of George Bender and others in the affected area to the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection for documents and information pertaining to this matter was denied. George, in his role to raise awareness and assist others affected by the CSG industries, questioned the independence and viability of the Gasfields Commission and the commissioners. In that context, George considered it ironic that this publicly funded body were not capable of properly fulfilling their publicly mandated role. Much has already been said about George Bender in the media since George took his own life. A local Gasfields commissioner has sought to link George's death to the issue of mental health and depression in rural areas. While George's family recognise that this is an important issue that must continue to be raised and addressed, and something that touches many in the farming community, it must be emphatically stated that George did not suffer from depression or mental health issues. These issues, although important in their own right, cannot be allowed to detract from the real concern in this case, which is the effect of the CSG industry on the lives of farmers and the environment. It was a sudden and unexpected act that caused George to take his own life. His family is and always has been close and supportive. Farming is a stressful occupation, but what is not recognised is the additional and unrelenting burden that having to deal with the CSG industry has had on the lives of those families affected. From the time the companies took an interest in George's land, it is something that the Benders have lived with daily. It is a constant source of worry, concern, and something that you cannot forget. George saw the impact on families who entered into agreements with CSG companies. He saw the impacts on the land, both agricultural and otherwise, of the mining operations. He did not hold back in trying to bring light to the very obvious effects and impacts of this industry, which were in turn and routinely denied by the companies and the government. The answer that you cannot prove any negative impacts because you do not have the expensive scientific reports did not satisfy this man of the land who had witnessed firsthand the effects. The issues confronting farmers affected by CSG mining creates differences of opinion within families and communities. These differences of opinion can then become divisions within families and communities. George witnessed firsthand this in those around him and commented upon the manner in which he viewed CSG companies as being adept at creating and exploiting such divisions. In the end, George Bender died from a broken heart at witnessing firsthand the tragedy unfolding around him. He fought to protect the air, land and water from the inevitable permanent damage that this industry is causing and has caused overseas. His struggles were not just for himself and his family, but for the whole country that depends on the agricultural and environmental resources unique to the Western Downs area. He was prepared to fight for what he truly believed in and call others to account. The tragedy is, in fighting for his country, his struggles are now his legacy. But it is the determination of those who have known and loved George Bender that his sacrifice not be forgotten. Throughout his struggle, George took it to the politicians and the company executives, but never criticised the workers in the community who were doing their jobs. Many in the community are now mourning the loss of the person that they could approach and talk to about their problems with the industry, someone who would listen and support them. Obviously a very great man. I'd like to call on Marion to come forward and just read a poem as well. Now Marion has experience with this insidious sort of mining, having come from Tara.
Enough. You've taken too much. We've had enough. We've had enough of your tearing our towns in two. Enough of your boom and your bust. Of the theft of our precious water while our farmlands are turning to dust. Enough of our kids' noses bleeding. Enough of their cries in the night. Enough of our farmers dying when they can no longer fight the good fight. Enough of broken election promises, commitments, and of your peddling fear and despair. You don't get to destroy our families, poison our water, our food and our air. Enough of gagging free people, harassed and forced off their land. Enough of your foolish obsessions. This is where we take a stand. We're not open for your kind of business, watching profits and jobs go offshore. You should have heeded the distant rumbling. But now the rumbling's a deafening roar. We are the people, and we say enough.
And that is the theme of many of these vigils. Enough is enough. Let's stand up and make people pay attention. I'd like to now just call for 1 minute's silence in remembrance of George and the dreadful fight that he's been fighting for that 10 years, and the fact that he got to the stage where he could no longer continue and took his own life. So 1 minute's silence. Thank you. Thank you. Now I'd like to call on Amber Goldsmith, lovely, talented lady and farmer's wife, to come forward and play a song for us. And while Amber is doing that, we've got some people with flowers who want to lay flowers, and also we're going to pass the hat for anybody who would like to donate to George's funeral.
From beneath the dusty brow he peers out across forever, puts a callous, well-worn hand upon the wheel he knows so well. As he fires that Fergie up, he sends a silent prayer to heaven. We both know he needs a little help. God, give him what you can. It's a goodbye, Aussie farmer, the one who's done us proud. You never look for handouts, just a chance to work it out. Wish we had stood beside you, but the chips were really down. It's a goodbye, Aussie farmer, to back it off to town. Banks and politicians know so little of the land, though they calculate and talk as if they understand. Watch the backbone of this country break while they smile and shake your hand. Inherit what's left over and sell to foreign land. It's a goodbye, Aussie farmer, the one who's done us proud. You never look for handouts, just a chance to work it out. Wish we had stood beside you while the chips were really down. It's a goodbye, Aussie farmer, to pack it off to town. We say, what can we do? And does it matter anyhow? If what we eat and wear and use is not from Aussie ground. Well, it matters to our children who are left to carry on. Wish all it took to make a change was hard work, rain and sun. Say goodbye, Aussie farmer, the one who's done us proud. You never look for handouts, just a chance to work it out. Wish we had stood beside you while the chips were really down. Is it goodbye, Aussie farmer? Do you back it off to town? Is it goodbye, Aussie farmer? But God knows we need you now. Thank you.
That is absolutely fantastic. Thank you. I just want to, it's brought me to tears. Flowers will be laid here for those who wish to come forward. And while you're doing that, I'd like to ask Nazrin Black to come forward, yet another farmer's wife.
My name's Nazrin Black and I'm a farmer's wife. My husband comes from a family of farmers. His father, his uncles, his brothers, his cousins, and they have farmed in the area for over 60 years with dairy, beef cattle and crops. When I married into the family about 8.5 years ago, I had no idea how hard it was to be in a farming family. I came from the city and never thought twice about where my food came from and the crushing sacrifices that farmers had to make to produce that food. The first real inkling that came was when we were planning our wedding. The time had to be planned around milking cows. The date had to be planned around whether it was planting, harvesting or baling. Jason and I now have 2 children, and there are many times, usually when things get a bit much for me, that I consider myself to almost be a single mum. This is not because Jason's not a good dad. He is an awesome dad. But it is because in these early years, the kids just don't get to see much of him. So much of the upbringing is left to me. They're in bed when he leaves for work at the crack of dawn, and again when he gets home well into the night. For them to spend time with him, they have a day at the farm when he's in the tractor, and they love it. But let's think about what Jason does with his time. Although he's not involved with the milking at the dairy, that's Keith's responsibility. A typical day for him would start early, whether it's summer, autumn, winter or spring, with shifting irrigation pipes, ploughing paddocks, repairing vehicles or equipment, transporting hay, negotiating deals, buying seed or some other farming product, checking on stock. Come nightfall, the work doesn't stop as he continues ploughing and harvesting by lights well into the night. Yes, he gets in to pop home for meals sometimes, but it's usually one meal a day that I see him, often when he has to deliver hay somewhere. I usually only know when he's home when he climbs into bed with me at the wee hours of the morning. We talk a lot on the phone. During the floods of 2011 and 2013, he spent many, many long hours getting cattle to safety, repairing fences, trying to save equipment, keeping roads clear and helping neighbours. These involved 16 hours a day, day after day. Then he pitched in to help other people tow their cars out of harm's way, pull round bales off the highway so traffic could get through. And he says, this is just what you do, and I am so proud of him. I know the sacrifices he makes to keep the farm going. The floods have left our farms in a mess, and the family is still trying to recover from them. The cost to the farm was hundreds and thousands of dollars in repairs and lost income. There is no insurance for this. The family works their butts off to stay afloat and keep the farm running. But I don't think they would have it any other way. They love farming, and they love their community. There are so many things about farming that people, particularly those in the city, don't understand. There are so many things that can cause a crop to fail or a cow to stop producing. But on top of the weather, the cost of seed, fertiliser, labour, electricity, water and everything else, it is too much to expect that farmers should have to fight for the right to farm. What is this country to look like if we didn't have farmers? Where would we get our food or our milk? It is time to look after the farmers and help them do what they do best, and that's farming. We need to protect our productive farmland and ensure that it is there for my kids, your kids and their kids into the future. Enough is enough.
Thank you. It's very emotional. And if I cry through it, well, just deal with it, okay? Whoa. There is a quote by Wendell Berry that is very accurate when describing a farmer. Farmers farm for the love of farming. They love to watch and nurture the growth of plants. They love to live in the presence of their animals. They love to work outdoors. They love the weather, maybe even when it's making them miserable. And there's another quote by Brenda Shope that says, my grandfather used to say that once in your life you need a doctor, a lawyer, a policeman and a preacher. But every day, 3 times a day, you need a damn farmer. A farmer's main goal is to produce a good crop and or healthy animals in order to make a living and to feed the population. Without food, the world would slowly die, and it's farmers who are working from daylight till dark and beyond every day to keep that from happening. Since the 1950s, I'm going to bore you with a few stats here, but it's a bit mind-blowing. Since the 1950s, international economic factors and changes in farming methods have led to a return of the larger farms of the mid-1800s, with them being more economically viable than small ones. But while the average size of farms has increased, the number of farming families in Australia has steadily decreased. Many modern individual farming families find that they struggle to make a profit, and some are forced to find extra work off the farm to supplement the farm income. Succession is now a priority business issue for farmers, and approximately 1/3 of all farmers are women. Farmers face many other hurdles daily in providing for this country. The challenges to access to fresh water, the legacy of high amounts of fertilisers, salinity, overgrazing, a tyranny of distance, transport costs, feral animals, commodity markets, extremes of weather, deregulation and changes to the environment, just to name a few, have tested Australian farmers to their limits. Particularly in the last few years, we can now add to that the lack of support from some banks, the growth of mining in prime farmland, government decisions slanted towards multinationals, the introduction of exotic weeds, diseases and pests, the low prices at the gate from the larger supermarket chains, the sale of prime land to foreign ownership, the importation of cheap foreign produce from countries with lower production standards, the inability to say no to mining on their own land, and the list goes on. Overall, Australia remains a net exporter of food, around 67% of our wheat production, 70% of sugar production, and 50% of the nation's barley production is exported. At the same time, farmers provide around 93% of Australia's domestic food supply. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organisation in 2009 estimated that by 2050, food production worldwide will need to increase to 70%. Most of Australia's land, about 2/3, is given over to farming production. About 90% of this land is for grazing on native pastures. So this leaves just 10% of the arable farmland to the production of food crops. In reality, what that means is only about 6% of the whole of the land of Australia is trying to produce 93% of our food. We should remind governments of this when they are considering what to do with our prime farmland. No farms, no food, no future. Successful and sustainable farms necessarily depend upon healthy soil and fresh water for their arable land, and this has an inbuilt resilience if biodiversity is maintained. A balance needs to be struck between the business of mining and the business of farming. A farmer's life and that of his family is tough enough and is so very different to the rest of us. I go to work, start at 8:30, I'm home 5:30, great, have weekends off. Husband and fathers often don't see their families on end, even though they live in the same house. They rise before everyone else and come home to bed long after the family's been tucked in. Farmers, now, I write, so that's one of my main skills, I guess. But farmers have to be proficient in business, truck driving, heavy machinery, mechanics, animal health and husbandry, midwifery, fencing, chainsaws, cropping, irrigation and water supply, plumbing, roofing, sales, construction, time management, showing, towing, hauling, poisons, fertilisers, planting, harvesting, baling, invoicing, GST, weights and measures, shooting, butchering, cooking, cleaning, conflict resolution, and let's not forget lifting heavy weights. They don't get weekends or public holidays off, and they are at the whim of Mother Nature, so they can put in months of hard yakka to have it destroyed overnight. Every day is different, except in one respect. Every day is hard work. This includes the farmer's family too, as the wife and kids are also heavily involved on the farms and in off-farm activities and community events, which keeps them connected. All of these statistics and facts point to the fact that farming is a difficult business and farmers are a unique, strong and tenacious breed. George Bender was a farmer. He was a man who loved the land and loved to farm. He was passionate about sustainable farming practices. He was very much like many of the farmers that we know who live around here. Yet George Bender was driven to take his own life by the crushing hopelessness that enveloped him after 10 long years of fighting to save his farming heritage from mining. And it has fortunately been the same for too many of our farmers here. Although their final stresses may have been different, the end result is the same. Devastated families and shattered communities. Unfortunately, Queensland is currently experiencing a 2.2% higher rate of farmer suicide than the rest of Australia, and this is just not acceptable. I have worked for several years now trying to raise awareness and support for people at risk of suicide after a farming friend took his life. When I heard of George's death, even though I didn't know him, I was devastated, and my first reaction was one of intense regret and anger. And I said, enough is enough. Something has to be done to get people to realise that this is a massive issue and it's tearing people apart. It's tearing families apart. Over the next day or so, I saw vigils for George Bender being organised across this country and decided that we needed to have one here too. But it wasn't just for George that I wanted to do this. For me, George became the beacon for all those farmers who've been driven to hopelessness for so many reasons. In remembering George and his family and their fight for survival that led to this tragedy, I wanted to also honour the struggles of our local farmers and show them that we care. I wanted them to know that we never again want to lose one of them because they felt the fight was too hard and that they were on their own. Here in the South Burnett, Boots and Bulldust runs a program called Seeds of Hope, where sunflowers are planted as a show of support for those doing it tough. So you often see them around. The motto is, when you see a sunflower, know that we care. This is a great program, but on its own, it's not enough. If we value our food future, we must value our farmers, and we must not do that in silence. In silence, the message is lost. And I've been too silent for too long. It is only in standing together that we show the farmers that we need them. We value them, and we're going to fight to ensure that this country has a food production future. We need to ensure that our governments make sound decisions regarding this food production future, including whether or not to sell land to overseas buyers or to approve mining permits. And they must prioritise farm production into the future with research and resources and backing up farmers in need. We need to see reasonable prices at the gate so that farming continues to be a business that men and women want to make their future in. And we need to provide community support to farmers who are doing it tough to ensure we never again lose a farmer to suicide, because enough is enough. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming along today and showing your support for George Bender and his family and for all the farmers in our community. If at any time anybody needs support, there are organisations out there. Boots and Bulldust is one. I have some flyers. Stress Busters is another that supports local farmers. Just talk to somebody. Don't think you're on your own. We're here to help. So thanks very much, everyone, and remember to just keep on supporting our farmers.